Fine, we're going to talk about global illumination. So global illumination is also another method by which we achieve indirect lighting, all right, in your scene. But this method uses photons, all right, as opposed to this point spread out by Maya, but by the Maya camera. But you can always use both of them together to achieve even better results, all right. So I'm going to turn on my global illumination. Remember, this is under my indirect lighting tab. All right. I turn that up and I click render again. You'll notice that this render will take a lot longer than our initial render. All right. So we have this is our initial one without final gather. This is one with final gathering. This is one with global illumination. You can see that the difference is are not so much. That's because in a scene like this, final gathering was already enough to achieve whatever uh, amount of indirect lighting we could get from this scene. A light source in this scene may add a bit more information for us. So if I wanted to add a light source, I might say to bookmark this camera position. So I might, for instance, let's say I want to create a fluorescent sort of box on the on top of our character. We'll put it on top somewhere here. All right, and make it white. We've talked about how to create all this, but I make it white, and then I increase the incandescence, which just adds a bit of glare to the light and makes it seem like a fluorescent um, light source. So if I come back to camera view, um, so I've explained that final gather does not require a point of light, but obviously it should use every point in its work. Global illumination, on the other hand, will use the light source that you have to add to the lighting in the scene. All right. So if I try and do a new render now, okay. Um, Notice that there's a bit more light on the floor now. It's not that obvious from our last render, but there's a bit more light on the floor compared to this one before it. All right, and that's the work of the final global illumination working. All right, now the use of this is more in terms of when you're working with product shots, where you need the lighting to be even around your character. Sometimes you use a dome light, a, so a dome setup where you create a large square around your product or image, and then you use white light with you add white color and increase the incandescent the same way I have, and then you render with that so that you get an even amount of say whiteness all over the character. It helps when you especially in those situations because you need that kind of light to work in your scene. All right. Um, do another render. Just test this. Okay, so that is how final gathering and global illumination work. All right, and you can use it to great advantage in your renders, especially when you are trying to get a lot more realistic looking renders from your scene. Alright. Quality under quality in the newer versions of Maya, all you need to do is just increase this to 1 when you are ready for the production work. But when you are still testing, you can drop it around to 0.25 or so that what you will get will still look, the color values will look right, only that it will not be as rich as when you increase the quality to 1 or above. But if you only point push it to 1 and you are ready for your final render, when you're ready to batch render your scene. Alright. Now to come to some portion here, we skipped it before, but you have to select a few features of your render. Alright, and two of them we have talked about already is in global illumination and final data. If we turn it on here, you turn on the same values here. If I turn global illumination off, dimensions up here. Alright, so it's just a way to turn everything that you really need on in one place. Shadows, you have to always turn them on if you want your scenes to have shadows. Shadows are an important part of realistic rendering, especially when you're trying to create depth. Alright, so you don't want to render a scene without a shadow. Alright, you can control how the shadows look with your light options and so on, and the kind of indirect lighting that you use, but you always want a shadow. One other uh, thing that you should always think about and add to your rendering process is ambient occlusion. Now, ambient occlusion is simply a rendering of your scene in both black and white, where the corners, where every smallest corner is represented by darker pigment. All right, and all the light portions that are brighter and in that do not have corners are represented with white. All right. Um, Now, apart from the fact that you can use this, apart from the fact that you have a white and black rendering of your image along with your normal render, you can use it to create additional shadows in your corners, in the depth areas, in the deeper areas of your object, all right? And it adds to the realism that you get from your scene, because it adds a little more shadow. So you can use your ambient occlusion to increase the shadowing in the corners and crevices of your object or the design you are trying to create. Now, like I said, the whole of the passes concept is to be able to do smaller edits. So without having to re-render, you can use your ambient occlusion pass to add more shadow to your scene. Alright, and that already helps if your director is saying this corner looks too light. Can you add a bit more darkness and shadow to it? You don't have to fire up your Maya software again and re-render for a certain number of hours again. You can always just use your ambient occlusion and increase the opacity of that layer in your composition software. So I usually add that to my rendering. Of course, adding that increases the time that your render takes, because your render usually has to calculate the ambient occlusion as a separate pass, right? So usually that takes time. Um, as I've enabled this now, but I cannot see that pass. Here's the reason why. Even though you have enabled these as features, they don't show up as passes until you set them up like so. All right. So you want to come to your passes section here, and this is how you set up passes for your thing. All right. This was not in some previous versions, especially if you are using some of the really old ones from 7 to 8 or so. But in much more recent versions, you have this sort of view. You can add passes to your scene. So I can create a pass by saying, clicking on my create render pass button, and then you have a number of passes that you can see. All right. I always encourage that Maya will always render out a beauty pass. The beauty pass is the pass that contains all of the effects and features that you have set up in your scene. All right. So it will always do that, but you may need some additional ones. So here we talk about adding an ambient occlusion pass. All right. I will just show you the ones that I use the most: camera depth. All right. So if I do this and I say create and close, it creates an ambient occlusion one. I add another one. I say camera depth or camera depth map, both of them work the same way. Notice the use of a prefix. This just helps you to recognize the pass or what family of rendering you are using, you are adding, or you are rendering or attaching these passes to. All right, so by doing that, you always be able to look for your amp and then find the pass that is um, attached to it. So I can do that too, and then it creates a amp the primark pass. There's a lot of other ones that you can map your specularity, map reflections. All right, let me look for that here. You can map specularity so that you only get information about these areas that shine. All right, and then you can use that to increase that shine or reduce that shine when you are compositing. All right, later on. I'm not sure I have that many reflections in my scene. All right, so I may not use that, but I'm sure I have specularity, so I can add that and then do that. When you do that, you select all the passes that you have created and attach them to your scene by clicking on the associate selected passes with current render layer. All right. You talked about layers, render layers before, and you can access them here. This is your master layer, which means everything in this scene. If you want to create a separate render layer again, you would have to select everything in your scene and come to layer, create layer from selected, and you have a separate render layer. But I'm just working with the main master layer here. And so you come back here, and as soon as you do this, you have associated with this render layer. Now they are part of this render layer, so every time this render layer is rendered, right, you will also render these passes. Note that that same render layer is selected here. If you create more render layers, they will all show up here and you will select them. All right. Maya, you use mental rate to render, especially when you are trying to do your more uh, realistic rendering, your renders. Render mental ray is a render engine that is used. All right. Of course, there's the Maya software and all these other ones, but they don't provide the same level of realistic rendering that mental ray does. All right. There are other renders engines with other softwares that you can use or integrate as plugins to Maya, but Maya comes default with mental ray, and there's a lot of work that has been done to make it as good as some of the rest, even though there are arguably some much better render engines out there that you should try out. All right, so I do this. There are always settings. There are settings to this that you may want to work with and tweak. I'm not sure that that is within the scope of this course at all. All right, but I'm just showing you the passes and how we can achieve them. So if I click my ambient occlusion, double click it, these are the options for it, and I can um, select what to do, how to enable certain layers or disable certain layers. All right, in my scene. All right, so trying to explain what the settings are may take too long, but just look at what I'm doing and you can try that along with your own. Some of these things increase the render time that you have, and so you want to make sure that your computer actually has the sort of specs that can handle some of these increases in the accuracy of these features. Um, this is really awkward. Some of these settings they have to do with how light or dark your render is. I'll come to my remarked depth. Um, that should be enough. Reduce this to this far clip plane determines how far into the scene our depth map will track. Specularity usually shouldn't require any settings here. So if I close this, alright, and do a render of my scene, this is my beauty pass that is always rendered, alright, and you can see it taking a lot more time than before to finish, and that is because there's a lot of other added features that is now rendering, including ambient occlusion and so on, and all the other separate passes that you have asked it to create. So you can see that it takes 32 seconds now to render this from 5 seconds where we started, right? And these are the sort of trade-offs that you make as you try and get better rendering. So you have rendered the passes. It's not you cannot see those passes right now, but if you come to your file, load render passes, you can see that these are all the passes that have been created. So that means that images of all these passes will also be created along with this one when you render them out of Maya. So if I look at my depth remap pass, um, I'm not getting anything yet, all right, and that means that I need to tweak my depth path a little more. So I come to my ambient occlusion path, you can see that in all the corners that are not directly facing the camera, all right, we have a bit of darkness. We have darkness, and in those areas where we have facing, we have extreme white. Now, those settings that I was tweaking, they are the ones that affect the um, the resolution of this area, right? So if I come back, click AO, these settings, the number of rays, the spread, all these things, they affect how the rendering comes out. All right. So you this um section requires you to do a lot of going in and coming out multiple times to achieve to get the best kind of results that you can. Right. So I set this far clipping plane to 300 because it seems as if my depth is not yet measuring anything as it were. So if I do that, I render again, and you can go through this process for quite a while as you try and get settings that work for all your passes, all right? Because as soon as you do that, it will create those passes for you. And if you are rendering an animation, all those passes become available as sequences of their own at the point of compositing. Okay, so I go again and load this depth pass. I can't yet see anything. Alright, so this one still needs a bit of work. I may have to use some other option to create the depth pass. This is our ambient occlusion. It seems like it's getting darker, so I may have to increase um, some of the values. This is our specular map. You can see just these areas. These are all the areas that correspond to this place and this place, all right? So in your 3D software, in your compositing software, you can now increase the whiteness here, and then by the time you are laying it on top of this one, it increases how bright this area is, all right? So if you're trying to show that this is close to a light source in front, by increasing that white, you can achieve that without having to come back and render another 32 seconds of this thing. You'll be able to make that tweak on this um, object. All right. So it will take quite a while trying to set up this depth remap path. Just looking. Um, let me see. Close this up. All right. So sometimes this takes a while as you are trying to figure out what works best. All right. Um, say 9 or 1, and then render again. Okay. Let's look at this again. Okay. The moment the map feature is going dark completely here, so I'll work on that. Ambient conclusion going to white has spread out our darks into very hard edges. We don't want this, so we're going to tweak that further there. All right. So you keep, this is how you keep going through the software trying to achieve the best results that you can. Um, so let me take this because this my map, my depth map isn't working so well. I'm going to take it out for now. All right, and leave my ambient occlusion so I can show you another way to create the depth map. All right. Um, so in our render, in our layers tab under the rendering section, I can create a copy of this and say by doing select object in this layer, it selects everything in our scene, and then I come to layer, create a layer from selected. So then I create a layer 2. All right. In this layer 2, I can, I spoke about how this window for passes was introduced in much more recent versions of Maya. All right. In the older versions, there is a way to create this same effect. All right, and to create the passes. So I'm going to do that by right clicking on this um, pass, coming to its attributes. All right, on that pass. Let me see. Coming to its attributes, selecting. Okay, okay, left clicking attributes. All right. And then from the attributes, I come to one of its presets, click on it, and then I have the luminance depth. All right. So you can use the luminance depth to also create your depth path. Now it has made changes to that scene. All right. To affect how you can render the depth out of this. Note that doing this does not change the fact that we still have a master layer that is all right. All right. So what happens is that with each render layer, you can have different settings for your scene. In this setting, it is using the Maya software just to render out that. So if I just make a quick render of this, you can see how it creates that depth path. Now notice that we can already see that there's a discoloration between the back and the front. All right, we may need to tweak that a bit more to achieve the value that we actually want. That may be far beyond the scope of this course, all right? But you can begin to get the sense of how to create passes in many ways, all right? If I show you a sample that I showed in the previous introductory class, I should show you a bit of some of the passes. So this is beauty. You saw diffuse, indirect diffuse, which is light from another source, reflection, specular, which is the other one we saw in our own scene, and so on. All right. If I go to a different one, you can see this is a diffuse, your ambient color. All right, your ambient occlusion. Notice we talked about that. If I come back to my normal render layer and do an ambient occlusion pass on my new layer or my master layer back, just to show the effects of the changes we made, especially on that ambient occlusion pass from before. All right. All right. So, okay, you can see the effect. If you are still not having a smooth uh, point as the one we have in this picture, for instance, your work is always your work is always somewhere in your work is always somewhere in your passes section, in the settings section. So either you want to increase the number of rays, or you want to increase the spread, or, or something like that. One of these things is what helps you to achieve what you are looking for, right? So you just have to keep tweaking these values until you get something that works. Remember, with each increase in values, the longer your renders take. All right, so just going back to examples where I did render. So this is your ambient occlusion, right? You can see these dark smooth areas. By the time you composite that back onto your object, you get something that is much uh, cleaner and crisper. The contrasts are a lot sharper. This is your shadow path here. Um, so this is another one where this is your diffuse, this is your ambient occlusion path, the subsurface path, your color or diffuse color, your specular, your reflections, your beauty path. And by the time this your beauty path is now the combination of all these layers with different values of opacity on them, and you go on and on like that. This is the way movies are made in the real world. There's no other way. Passes are created, rendered out in either OpenEXR or some other format, and then put together in softwares like After Effects or Nuke, and you get this is what we were trying to find with our depth layer. All right. So we're trying to find with our depth layer. You can see there's a gradation from white to black, which you were just beginning to see in that last render that I made, right? And then they are all put together like this, and that is how you get a complete render out. So if I do this, look at ambient occlusion, you can already see they are smoother. All right, this is what you would love to get out of your ambient occlusion. This is a bit too dark, so we may have to reduce some of the other values, but you can get the idea of what we are trying to create. So in our last class, we are going to talk about putting it all together in a compositing software and making it look good as it were. So um, we'll talk about that in our next class. That will be all for now. Um, we'll talk much more about this in our last class. All right. So thank you.